Thank you so much, Gila. That was a wonderful introduction. I appreciate it. I always love to see all of you. I am so glad to be with you today. I want to talk about gender and Judaism. There are many, many things that could be said. I'm going to focus particularly on the halachic revolution with regard to gender and Judaism. And my central thesis, as always I give you my thesis, is that women's evolving role in Judaism is not a story, as you might have noticed, of steady progress, but of a negotiation between text, halakha, and lived reality. And in fact, halakha, Jewish law itself, is always a negotiation between text and living reality. The key halachic barrier was never really prohibition, but the problem of exemption, I would argue. And I would argue that the next stage requires a takana, shifting women from exempt to obligated, and allowing halakha to reflect contemporary reality without abandoning its own internal logic. And this I dedicate to my wife, who, besides being a professor of Talmud and Rabbinics at Vassar, is also a musmechet of Maharat Yeshivat Maharat, and her sort of emphasis in her psikah, in her halachic ruling, is always the necessity of halakha returning to its own internal logic in order to be able to create change. So I just want to, I'm just looking around the room and I see that we're all people of a certain age, basically, right? Nobody's 18 here. And I spend my time across the street teaching people who are 18 to 22. And I like to start, when I talk about gender at all, by talking about my experience with the shifting ground of gender. About 40 years ago at Yale, I had a wonderful professor named John Boswell. John was the first person to write about gay people in the Middle Ages, by which he meant gay men, but those were the times, right? And if you can imagine, there's a whole, if you just Google gay people in the Middle Ages, there's a whole industry, there's whole libraries dedicated. There was one book then called Christianity, Social Tolerance and Homosexuality. It was about gay people in the Middle Ages. And he would often say in class shocking things, truly shocking things. Let me give you an example. He would say, when a person went on a journey in the Middle Ages, he or she would hide their belongings cleverly to avoid brigands. So I say that to my students. What's shocking about that? Let me repeat it. When a person went on a journey in the Middle Ages, he or she would hide their belongings cleverly to avoid brigands, robbers, right? Still don't get it. They don't get it. Maybe you don't notice either, because we live in 2025 and not in 1982, right? The shock was that she appeared in a sentence about medieval people at all, right? The default human, historically, grammatically, had always been he. So the way everybody except John Boswell said it was, when a person went on a journey in the Middle Ages, he would hide his belongings. Right? So before the contemporary inclusivity of they, right, there was a much earlier revolutionary work of insisting on she, of talking about male carriers instead of mailmen, right? Of talking, of acknowledging, talking about actors rather than actors and actresses, right? There was a sense of naming inclusion before assuming it. So we've come a long way in 40 years, and in some ways we've piggybacked the question of women in terms of gender. We jumped over she to they. So all my students are interested in they pronouns, but she, women, right, not so much. And as somebody who, a lot of people were raised by wolves, perhaps, I was raised by feminists, somebody who, comes from a feminist household, it's always been on my mind. And if you deal with the halachic, the Jewish legal dimensions of Jewish practice and law, you cannot but avoid this question. Right? So imagine, to begin with, two rabbis talking about the situation with regard to women, right? Two different explanations, the same result. So if you ask apologists, even today, go over to your local, I don't know, Chabad, and ask them why women can't be leaders in the synagogue, right? Why women's voices are silenced, why women don't have halachic equality with regard to edus, with regard to witnessing, why women can't be rabbis. They'll tell you that women are exempt from the commandments, the time-bound commandments, positive commandments, as we'll discover, because they're spiritually elevated. You know, your typical apologist says, you think I want to daven every morning? I have to because I'm a man and my nature is that I don't want to daven. Women are just spiritually elevated and they don't even need to daven. Very nice, except that it's bullshit, right? Secondly, another explanation, right? Women are exempt because they're too busy raising children. That is, women are too busy raising children. So one asks then, well, what if a woman is not raising children? They say, well, we have to go we go after the majority. We have to satisfy the question of the majority. So you have a mystical pseudo-complement, right? Which is improbable. You can't prove that women are spiritually more anything than men or less anything than men. And a sociological observation that is at best a wonky sociological observation because it is highly conditioned on time and place and history. Yet both lead to a problem through exemption of a problem of exclusion. So here's the thing. You could say women are exempt because they're spiritually elevated. Women are exempt because they're busy. But the problem halachically is that once you exempt a woman, she cannot acquit other people who are obligated. So if you're exempt from an obligation, you can't lead a group of people who are obligated. And therefore you have a problem. So it's not only exemption, but it bleeds over. In fact, it leads to exclusion. Right? So what are these commandments of the 613 or 612 or 614 commandments of the Torah? What are the commandments from which women are exempted by the rabbis, by the Mishnah, the Talmud, and the codes? These are time-based positive commandments. So when the Torah says, don't kill, that's a negative commandment, and it doesn't say don't kill between the hours of 9 and 12 on Thursdays. It's a blanket negative commandment. It is incumbent upon men and upon women. Actually, it doesn't say don't kill because you can kill. It says don't murder. Sorry, I stand or sit corrected. Don't murder, right? Don't murder is a blanket negative commandment incumbent upon men and women, right? What about, I don't know, you should pray at specific time period twice a day and optionally a third time a day. That's a positive commandment. You should do something. And it has a time constraint. You can't daven shachris, the morning prayer, when it's no longer halachically the morning. So it has a particular time constraint. From those commandments, women are exempted. There's a couple of time-bound positive commandments from which women are not exempted. Notably, and there's a third possibility, notably eating matzah on the eve of Passover, right? You have to eat matzah, a certain amount of matzah, and you need to eat it at a specific day before a specific time. So it is both a positive obligation and it is time-bound or time-connected. And hearing the Megillah, hearing the book of Esther read on Purim. And why is that? Because women were nichalu be'oisanes, that women were included in the miracle, right? The third possibility, there are a couple of others, but the third possibility is that women are obligated to eat and or sleep in the sukkah. That is a point of more debate. Does the sukkah involve a nes, a miracle? Is this sukkah intended lezecher, in memory of the physical sukkot that the Israelites built in the wilderness, in which case it wouldn't be a miraculous event. That's what you do. When you're camping, you build a tent of some kind, right? Or is the sukkah lezecher anane hakavod, is the sukkah in memory, in recollection of the clouds of glory that accompanied the Israelites in the desert? That was a miraculous manifestation. And in that case, women are included in the miracle. So there's a debate about sukkah. But matzah, but Megillah, right? But sukkah, and also shofar. Women are required to hear the shofar. You know, you probably all know women or maybe you don't, but women in frum communities who don't make it to synagogue for the tefillot on Rosh Hashanah, but they come to hear shofar, right? Which is why the time that the blowing of the shofar will be announced, right? And that has yet another reason. I'm not going to get into all the reasons, but it's clear lechatchila, that to begin with, abanitio, that there is an idea of exempting women from time-bound commandments, but there's also an idea of exempting them from that exemption, right? So we're already dealing with a halachic issue that is very, shall we say, fungible. It has somewhat porous borders because the halachic authorities realized that if they didn't include women being obligated, say, at Passover or at Purim or in the Sukkah or to hear the shofar, very soon the sort of borders of community would evanesce. And women would find better things to do with themselves, whether it was fussing in the kitchen or dealing with the children, right? This way, they began to say, even though you're exempt, it is actually incumbent upon you. And there's debates whether this exemption holds pride of place, or there is an incumbency, etc. For things like matzah, for things like Megillah, for things like shofar, yes. For the issue of sukkah, depends on the community, the time, etc. The exemption, of course, was built on assumptions about domestic labor and about gender roles. So we need to ask ourselves what happens when the background changes, when women are surgeons and scholars and combat officers and judges and CEOs. Does the exemption remain protective, or does it become constraining? Now, you might ask yourself, how do I presume that the exemption is protective and not merely a reflection of the cosmic reality that men and women are different and women are spiritually superior? So if you like the mystical idea that women are spiritually superior to men, there's some sort of endemic, intrinsic quality in women that would merit their exemption. But here's the thing. When you say that women are exempt from positive commandments that are time-bound, without actually saying it, you are saying that these exemptions are conditional on conditions of people's lives, not conditions of them, their selves. And so the question, what is the exemption designed to do, is a legitimate question. There are some kind of hardcore das Torah people, because the rabbis said it, that's enough. They said it, there's nothing else to say, right? Who will say, it's not for you, Professor Epstein. It's not for you, Rabbanit Vetter, to try to figure out why the exemption is. The exemption exists, right? But here's the thing. Halacha is designed to change with circumstances. Our lives, and therefore our halacha, are not the same as they were in the 2nd century. And so one of the tools at our disposal for understanding what to do with halakha as circumstances change is to further our understanding of why, right? So there are certain things like shatnez, not mixing wool and linen. You could have an archaeological explanation. It's because that in antiquity, the priests of pagan deities wore wool and linen together. You could have an agricultural, spiritual explanation that wool is an animal product and linen is a plant product, whatever, right? But that doesn't change the prohibition. Because if the fact was, let's pick one, that wool was an animal product and linen was a plant product, and never the twain shall meet, there's sort of a separation of categories, and it represents order in the divine universe, and only in the high priest wore a garment of mixed wool and linen, right? Could that be countervened, right? Those are kind of eternal verities about things. But to say that women are exempt or not obligated because these are time-bound positive commandments seems to indicate that there is a desire to protect women's roles. Listen to me. I did not say to protect women. Okay? Women, historically, have been helpful to men. That is, if the woman is raising the children and cooking the food and cleaning the house, it's good for guys. So the rabbis desired to protect women's time in this way, not for the good of women, but in order to protect men, right? What they did was create a system that was a subjective system. And moreover, the exemption eventually becomes constraining, and that constraint leads to disenfranchisement. And that's what we need to think about when we think about this situation. Now, nowadays, just a side word, it's become very popular to teach about, to discuss the idea of multiple genders in the Talmud, right? You know, popular discourse on gender nowadays says that the rabbis recognize 5 or 6 or 7 genders. And this is true. Halachic literature identifies categories such as tumtum, androgynous, ailonit, saris, etc. These are categories of gender difference, but they're categories of gender difference from a presumed norm. Okay? The purpose was not identity celebration. We're free to celebrate identity diversity. That's cool. Want to do that? That's cool. But we can't retroject that onto the rabbis. The rabbis addressed the categories of people who were intersexed, or people who changed their sex, or people who were of ambivalent sex, or people who felt that they were one sex in another body, or people who had the physical characteristics of both or neither sex, right? They addressed these categories in order to establish what was for them normative, who was obligated, and who was exempt. And so it's very, very important to acknowledge that historically the project of the rabbis was legal demarcation, not gender theory, and certainly not diversity celebration. They held up the male body as the most perfected body, and of these differentiated persons, androgynous, tumtum, ailonit, saris, etc., the closer you were to having a male body, the more you were enfranchised, right? And the more status you had in the community. And so there is a status hierarchy among the differentiated bodies. This matters because the use of those categories, just as the use of the category woman, another for the rabbis differentiated body, was always tied to obligations and or exemptions We think exemption is a good thing, but remember, exemption leads to exclusion, leads to disenfranchisement, right? So obligations versus exemptions, exclusions, disenfranchisements. This was not an affirmation of spectrum identity in the modern sense. Again, I stress, if you wish to affirm spectrum identity for yourself, for your children, for your friends, for your society, right? That is something that we're all free to do. But you can't imagine that the rabbis were thinking in that direction. They merely identified what they saw in their world as we might identify what we see in our world. And in a sense, that is progressive because there were societies in which these things weren't talked about at all. But that the fact that they were talked about was in order to disenfranchise certain categories and to prioritize and elevate in the hierarchy other categories. So don't celebrate the rabbis for recognizing that there were androgyni, tumtums, ailonits, and sarises, right? And certainly don't fall into the trap of saying, unlike in Christianity or Islam or blah, 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 the Jews were much better about this. It's just not true. Christianity and Islam also acknowledged categories in order to, in one way or another, denigrate them. Okay, so we can't champion the rabbis on that. I want to show this afternoon, this morning, this evening, wherever you are, the following roadmap. I want to describe how exemption and not prohibition was really what shaped women's halachic status. I want to talk about the modern rupture, where we have two radically different paths of change. And I want to talk about a leap that I'm, along with some other people, would propose, which is an intervention within halakha to obligate women fully and thus extend the optionality of commandments in that case. So let's begin with the foundation, biblical and medieval landscape, right? So as you know, in Genesis in the Bible, the human being is created as an androgynous being. It's created male and female, and the female side, right, Selah, we don't know what Selah means when we encounter that word in the Bible. God took the Selah from the Adam, the earthling, which was androgynous. The earthling has both genders. And God takes the Selah and builds upon it or turns it into, separates it out as woman. So to know what Selah means, you have to look for the next place it occurs. And the next place it occurs in the Bible is in Exodus with the building of the tabernacle in the wilderness, where we have Sla'eh HaMishkan. We have the sides of the tabernacle. And so Selah means side. And it is a logical assumption to think that in the human body, the side is the rib. So we translate rib, but that is not accurate. God takes the female side of the androgynous being and brings it around so they can face each other and couple and produce children. But in separating this androgynous being, there is a differentiation then of gender roles, which begins in Genesis, right? The Talmud eventually, via a verse about tefillin, phylacteries on the arm and hand, establishes the category that women are exempt from mitzvahs aseh shahaziman geraman, right? From positive commandments that are time connected. Note the idea that women are exempted. This does not mean that women are prohibited. And in fact, historically, at a number of different junctures, and let me say at a number of different junctures, but not all different junctures, because sociology plays a strong part in the way communities react to innovation or difference. But in many contexts, women who perform these mitzvot were praised and not rebuked because they were not prohibited, right? But then there are cascading halachic consequences of exemption to which I referred before. right? So, for instance, if you are exempt from praying twice a day and once optionally, you cannot lead a minyan, a prayer quorum of 10 individuals who are obligated in the commandment. You might lead a prayer quorum of 10 people who are unobligated in the prayer commandment, that is, other women, right? But that's not technically a minyan, because a minyan means a group of people who are obligated. Then we have the question of the shliach tzibur. The shliach tzibur is the person who fulfills the obligation on behalf of those people, because of those 10 people who are obligated, maybe one of them, maybe two of them, maybe 9 of them don't know the prayers well enough to say them fluently, and they need to respond then, amen, to the prayer of the person who is leading, and thus that person acquits the other people of their responsibility to say the prayer, right? But if the person leading does not have the responsibility, it doesn't work. Can't be a shliach tzibur. So you can't be a member of a minyan. You can't be a shliach tzibur. If you want to witness something in a rabbinic court, you cannot, because you have to be a fully halachically obligated individual. And many other prohibitions, divorce, right, remains in the hands of the husband for a lot of reasons, but also including the fact that halacha can't accept a woman's testimony, right, which creates this terrible situation of agunot. So there's really a cascade from this very nice, women are not obligated, we exempt you, isn't that great? It's like when you give somebody a gift, right? You give them a cute puppy, and you say, here's an adorable puppy, and then, 6 months later, it's like, who's feeding the thing? What does it cost? Who's walking it? Right? And the puppy ends up being this is a mixed metaphor, an albatross around your neck, right? So I give you this gift of exemption because you're too spiritual to need mitzvot, or you're too busy to be able to do mitzvot, right? And as a result, I burden you with permanent exclusion from the polity of who is an active Jew. Okay? So you might say, okay, so what's the big deal? The big deal is that there's 51% of Jews can't acquit others of their responsibility. So Monty asks, I just happened to see this, I'm sure there are other comments, but can I explain that a little more? Sure. It's like if you need to, you yourself, according to halacha, you yourself need to be required to do something in order to acquit others. Right? So think of a secular metaphor. I can't think of one exactly right now, but maybe one will come to me or you. You can't do certain things unless you have a particular kind of education or expertise, right? You can't. It might. What you can't. Oh, you can't. You can't. If you're not a U.S. citizen, you can't be president of the United States. You can't lead other citizens of the United States, right? So there's some requirement of you that happens to be an essential requirement, right? You can't lead. Right? We'll talk more about that afterwards. And please, I'm not going to answer any more questions now, because now people are like, now he asked a question, I can ask a question. You can certainly ask questions. We'll leave them for the end. So what's the medieval mindset around these things? Well, in agrarian society, domestic labor fell overwhelmingly on women, and the exemption protected them from an impossible double burden. Right? We were told in the 60s and 70s, women, you can have it all, right? You can have it all. And in fact, as if you were a woman in the 60s and 70s and 80s and try to have it all, you realize it's not so easy to have it all. And the rabbis didn't want to burden women with having it all because then, as I said, they could not serve their husbands. Okay? And simultaneously, this locks them out of public religious authority. So it was structure, not strictly malice, but structure and convenience that built the hierarchy. In a post-medieval sense, there was a tremendous rupture. There were really two paths to progress toward the realm of making women responsible halakhic individuals or responsible individuals that were very different one from another. So the first path was liberal Judaism. So beginning with the German Reform, which remained sociologically, if not anti-feminist, slow to accept feminism, although there were female rabbis early in the German Reform movement. But this sort of social hierarchy and structure, if you can imagine it, of German 19th century households was still very male-dominated. But eventually, in America, Reform, Reconstructionist, and most conservative Judaism chose to supersede halachic categories of exemption in their entirety, right? So the idea of these liberal Judaisms was that times have changed, and so Judaism must change. And this allowed a sort of immediate egalitarianism with women as rabbis, cantors, witnesses, parts of minyan, etc. And actually a very interesting thing happened, which is for a while, although the pendulum may be swinging back now, once women in the liberalizing movements began to take a greater role in synagogue life, a lot of men decided to stay home and cede the synagogue life to women. So when in the 80s and 90s, I was often a guest of or knew people at or visited, Reform, Reconstructionists and conservative shuls that were entirely female dominated. Right? It was a woman rabbi, a woman cantor. The men came, but women were learning Torah reading and laning, and it was a very sort of women-centered environment, much in the way that certain churches are that way, right? And that was really a very, very big change, which is sort of evening out now, although I think the demographics still in some liberal Jewish communities is that women take a very strong role. The other, of course, possibility is within Orthodoxy, how you innovate from within. And as opposed to immediate egalitarianism, right, there is a slow, intricate, and very legally constrained sort of approach to admitting women. See, because it's still a male gatekeeper culture in which, by the grace of men's permission, women now have greater autonomy. But that is changing. We begin to see women's tefillah groups operating in parallel to minyanim, right? In a way, the Orthodox scene is more interesting, let's say, because when you are in the liberal scene, you just say, we're admitting women. Now we have women cantors, we have women rabbis, we have women lay leaders. Okay, we did it. We did the thing, right? In Orthodoxy, it's a slow crawl, right? So you sort of see the mechanism of how this works halachically. The question that arises for some Orthodox groups is, well, nobody ever said that women couldn't form their own prayer groups. We won't call them minyanim. We'll call them tefillah groups, women's tefillah. And women will lead them for other women. And if a man comes, the man can stand behind the mechitza. I've been to many of these bar and bat mitzvah occasions in which, the men are behind the mechitza. That's one thing, right? A fascinating move toward rabbinic ordination has been the program of Yoatzot Halacha, right? Female guidance provided particularly on intimate laws, I give a slight trigger warning to you on this. You know that if a woman has her period, she's prohibited, the couple is prohibited from sex with each other for quite an extensive period, up to half the month, depending on how long the period is, because there is an addition, a rabbinic addition to the 7-day period in which women don't have sex with their husbands, and so it can be quite a long time. What happens if after having her period, the woman spots, right? Finds a spot of some color or other in her intimate garments. So in earlier history, believe it or not, women would send their underwear, right, in a private way, through a sort of box number, to a rabbi whose job was to recognize what the ketzim, what the stain was. Is this blood, therefore she's prohibited? Is it not blood, therefore she's permitted? Now, you can imagine that even in pre-modern times, it was an embarrassing thing for a woman to do this. It was an embarrassing thing. And so very often what happened was women just said, I'll forget about it. I'll consider myself as if I'm nidah. I'm prohibited to my husband for another 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks. The result being that men weren't getting sex. Right? And so what has happened, interestingly, in the past 20 years is that a new, let's call it halachic industry, has grown up in which women adjudicate this issue for other women. It makes it easier for some women. And why was this permitted? Where women were banned from studying practical halacha in many places. There were places like Italy where women learned shechita, women learned slaughtering, right? And they learned the halachas, the halachot of that, the halachot of slaughtering. This was not an area, right, that was in general women's learning, women's advanced Talmud or halachic learning was prohibited, if not frowned upon. Well, when it comes to the prospect of not having sex for 1 month and then another month, etc., men kind of caved on the issue. And so this institution of Yoatzot Halacha, women giving legal advice on intimate issues, was increasingly permitted. It's still banned in some, fringier circles, but it's becoming more and more common. Now, what happens then? People say, wait a second. If women can learn the very complex halachot about the difference between a yellow, a pink, a white, mixed stain, right? Very complex, extremely complex. Why shouldn't they be able to adjudicate other matters, right? Are they intellectually inferior? You can't say so if you're allowing them to adjudicate on this very serious, very important matter, because if you have sex with your wife and she's nidah, it's a terrible, terrible sin. Right? So you have to have a real expert make the determination. Oh, well, if she's a real expert in that, why can't she be a real expert in something else? And so advanced women's Talmud learning, creating female Torah scholars of the highest caliber, began to emerge and evolve as well. One could say that it all evolved from the prospect of men not being able to have sex with their wives. But however it evolved, You're aware that in the Takana of Rabbeinu Gershom in Ashkenaz, in the High Middle Ages, the prohibition on multiple wives only came about because the women refused to support Rabbeinu Gershom's yeshiva. If he didn't do something about the fact that there was still a law in the books that a man could marry multiple wives, because merchants were going off to India and China on the Silk Road, and they were temporarily marrying another person. They were in concubinage, right? And they lived there for 6 months with one wife, and then they came back to Shvire and they had their wife. Not acceptable, said the women. We're staying home and supporting a yeshiva, right? So pressure is put on the community. And that's how things change. It's not often pretty, but things change within a halachic system in that way. These are extraordinary advances, but they remain workarounds. They expand the periphery without altering the pillars. Minyan, witness, leadership, these pillars that rest on obligation. And there are some excellent authors on this, from Daniel Sperber to Tamar Ross to Avi Weiss, who've discussed these halachic innovations. I've had to struggle with this kind of all my life because I wanted to live a halakhically observant lifestyle, and yet I could not myself, because of how I was brought up and because of what I view as my position in history and because of what I view as simply fair, I could not sort of live in that world. I have a deep respect for halachic structure. I have a deep admiration for within the system creativity. But eventually I recognized that these innovations all treat women's participation as permitted and not mandated. There's an optionality that's not an equality. And as long as it is an optionality, it can lead to exemption, which can lead to exclusion. So I would make an argument, and I'm not a halachic expert, but there are people who are making these arguments, that a move needs to be made here from exemption to obligation. Not times have changed, so halacha must change. That's a good argument, but it doesn't solve the problem for a lot of people. But rather, the reason for the exemption no longer applies. If the halacha is indeed based on the exemption, basing the exemption on practical domestic realities and on different roles and on different time constraints, as it seems to be doing because it talks about time-bound mitzvot, when those realities shift, the halacha is obligated to address the underlying cause, not to cling to the obsolete structures and make believe that things are today the way they were in the year 203, right? So there have been throughout history various takanot. I mentioned one, the takana, the innovation of Rabbeinu Gershom, that in spite of the fact that Abraham had how many wives? 4 wives, right? And that Jacob had 2 wives and 2 concubines, and it was always possible in the East, right? In the West, as of the year 1100, men, only 1 partner per marriage. We need a takana that obligates women in all previously time-bound commandments. And once obligated, they naturally qualify for minyan, for prayer leadership, for witnessing, for public halachic authority, right? This is a kind of hopeful dream. I won't say it's a pipe dream, right? Because we need a recognized halachic authority who will be mikubal, who will be acceptable to all those halachically observant people. And that's just not going to happen, because every time, particularly on this issue, that Orthodox Judaism moves toward inclusiveness, the right wing says, well, you're not Orthodox anymore. That is the sword on which you die as an Orthodox Jew. Giving mitzvot, mandating mitzvot for women, that is the thing, right? That is the thing. So, I would also add, by the way, just from a third wave, fourth wave feminist perspective, that the idea of double labor is a problem, right? It's real, serious, unavoidable, right? I think in any such takana, there should be a mandate of shared domestic responsibility for men, not as a moral suggestion, but as a legal expectation, right? Time-bound needs to be reconsidered when caregiving conflicts arise, right? There should be flexibility for any primary caregiver, male or female. So maybe men can be exempt in certain circumstances. Children should be an essential infrastructure of as part of the synagogue, not childcare. I'm sorry, not an optional, not a perk, right? So let me just sum up, because I see we're coming toward the time. Although for most orthodoxy, besides open orthodoxy, left orthodoxy, the Avi Weiss Maharaj Yeshiva ambit, and when you're in it, you kind of think that that's the world, but it's not the world. There are a lot of Orthodox people out there who, including women, who don't want such a thing, right? That is the sword that Orthodoxy says you die on. You are no longer Orthodox because you gave the women the Torah to hold, or you blah, 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 right? And who is it for me to give? That's another question, right? But it is the sword that I'm willing to die on. I would say, as a recap, that exemption shaped hierarchy. Liberal Judaism's overturned the system. Orthodoxy kind of danced around it on its left end. And the third path is a takana obligating women fully by people who take halakha seriously. So, I often imagine getting up to the pearly gates if I get there, because I may go to the other place. It's entirely, the jury is out. And whoever's, I don't know who's at our pearly gates, not St. Peter, obviously, maybe Eliyahu, saying, so why in your minyan did you say that your minyan included women? Why did you let women carry the Torah? Why did you let women act as shliach tzibur? So I would say, listen, women, although they're exempt, they live as obligated Jews, studying, praying, leading, sustaining community. The law lagged behind reality. I argued only that halakha should recognize what women had already undertaken from devotion rather than demand. I argued that obligation should follow responsibility. And if Eliyahu gives me trouble, I'll talk to God. And I'll say to her, this is fidelity. This is not rebellion. Halakha must meet Jews where they stand, not as guests in God's house, but as its full, obligated heirs. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We've got so many questions. It's a very topical piece of conversation. What came up a few times was Shabbat, because Shamor v'Zachor, is that considered to be a positive commandment, and with women lighting candles on Shabbat, and it's time-bound?
Right. Well, Shabbat has two aspects, right? One is the positive commandment of remembering that it's Shabbat, right? Setting aside Shabbat as a holy day and doing all kinds of things on Shabbat, and Shamor, that's Zachor. Shamor, which is the negative commandments, right? Not lighting a fire, not et cetera, et cetera. And they, because the rabbi said, Shamor v'Zachor b'dibur echad ne'amru. The word, the lavs, the don't do's, and the you shall do's were said by God as one articulation. Then everybody is obligated in Shabbat. That's always been the traditional view. Nobody has ever asked the question, are women not obligated in Shabbat observance? And that's where it stands.
Thank you. With your takana revolution,
sounds Japanese.
Would that have to come from men, or could it come from women who have been ordained through Maharat? Because if it is to involve women, then and it's related to women, could it come from women?
So here's the thing. It's not who it comes from. It has to be mikubal harov. It has to be accepted by the majority. And my guess would be that the majority of women who are interested in such a takana would easily accept it from wherever it came. The problem, of course, is the men, right? And so for in a practical sense, if I was going to say, if somebody said, to me tomorrow, okay, the Jews, the ultra-Orthodox and Orthodox Jews of the world have gotten together. We've decided we're going to institute this takana. Who should make the takana? I would have to ask, who is the Gadol Hador? who's the acknowledged greatest rabbi of the generation, right? And that would have to be the person who did it, right? If we give and allow for and encourage sufficient development among women that they become halachic authorities on the level of Reb Moshe Feinstein or Reb Saadia Gaon or Maran HaRambam, or then of course such a person it would be acceptable upon me. The question is, for those people who are skeptical, and a good question is, why should we care about them? Right? But for those people who are skeptical, what's going to be convincing? So it's an excellent question. I don't have an answer for it.
Okay. And what about the mitzvah of procreation? That seems to be incumbent on only men?
It's incumbent on men because of not because it's a commandment that is time bound, but because it was the commandment that was given to the first creature in the Garden of Eden, and because of this slippery grammatical problem, is that creature an androgynous creature? Is it a person named Adam, or is it a creature called the Earthling? Right? The rabbis decided to lay the incumbency upon men. The actual sociological reason for that may very well have been because it was easier for in a society to match up men. There might have been a lot of different sociological reasons for saying it's an obligation on men, but we can't make it an obligation on women. Maybe it's that men in ancient medieval times were less inclined to marry if they didn't feel the burden of a commandment to procreate, right? So there's a lot of possible reasons, but it is incumbent on men. There are other commandments that are incumbent on men, not because they're time bound, or positive. This is positive.
In today's changing society, you mentioned about how your students are occupied with the term they, and you did touch on the androgynous and the
male and the saris and the.
So how in this day and age can we relate to time-bound commandments and non-binary and intersex people?
Right. So here's the thing. It might seem, in terms of the popular media and what we know, right? What we quote unquote know about our society. And if you walk across the street at Vassar College, like every second person is, transgender or non-binary, etc. It may seem that way, but in fact, it's not quite. The numbers aren't quite that large, right? And so in a non-traditional, in a liberal society, there's no issue, right? Everybody is radically included. So seating isn't a problem. Obligation, the commandments isn't a problem. Leadership isn't a problem. That's not a problem. It would only be a problem in traditional halachic communities, which asks for some degree of gender separation at prayer. It doesn't have to be women behind men or behind a curtain. That's not an issue. But what do you do? Do you have a mechitza? Do you have a trichitza, right? So those issues, and how do you deal with all the many questions that come up when you deal with trans and non-binary people? Those are issues that are actually being dealt with in the progressive Orthodox community nowadays, and will continue to be dealt with. But it's they're issues that are in development, and they're in development actually in communication with between halachic authorities and people who are in the category who want to be halachically observant. So I think it will emerge from case-by-case bases and become a part of halakha that has not been dealt with before, but that must and should and ethically, morally, it's obligatory to be dealt with.
Thank you very much for that. One last question. When we were talking about Rabbeinu Gershom and polygamy, there are other laws related to marriage and widowers and male widowers marrying the sisters, and is that still applicable today?
Right.
And
So you're
how
talking
that,
about Yibum and Chalitza and all
yeah.
of that. So it depends where you are. These are they're very particular matters of, if a man's, God forbid, a man's wife dies, does the brother-in-law have an obligation to marry the widow? These are things that are on the books, that are relatively, actually, so this is interesting, right? Relatively easy to get around halachically. There are, just as in the prohibition of interest, right? There are halachic workarounds. Yibum and chalitza, there are halachic workarounds. Even the idea of a Kohen marrying a divorcee, it's tricky, but there are halachic workarounds. If a man refuses to give his wife a divorce, there are inadequate, but these are developing right now, halachic workarounds, right? So the question is, if all of these things have their halachic workarounds, why not the big elephant in the room? And I think it's just because men like their comfort, and men are still, to a great extent, running the more orthodox, or the orthodox end of this halachic business. And I hope that we won't have to wait until Eliyahu comes to solve this problem. I think it's very important to keep pointing out all the halachic workarounds and ingenious halachic strategies that have enabled people, men, to get what they want in this world, and to apply them as we continue to women. There are a couple of very good questions in the private questions to me. Unfortunately, I can't answer them because we are at time.
Thank you so much, Professor Epstein, for your insightful talk into the workarounds and the expansion around the pillars. And I hope that we can lead to a change in the pillars. Thank you to everybody for also attending. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Tamar Ross called it Expanding the Palace of Torah. I hope we can do that. Take care. Okay. It's a pleasure.
I will add that into the
yes.
the follow-up.
Ross, Sperber, and Weiss. 3 very important people, along with Judith Plaskow, who had a critique but not a solution. Liz...
and also Rabbanit Henkin.
Yeah, Rabbanit Henkin, right, for sure. So there are a lot of great people on this.